Hey everyone and welcome back. Today we are diving into the fascinating world of bilingualism and how speaking two languages can actually rewire your brain. We're looking at a new study out of McGill University. They use brain imaging to show how speaking two languages can actually change the physical makeup of your brain and how it makes it more efficient and adaptable. Now, I'm sure many of you are familiar with fMRI scans, so for those who aren't, it's basically like a way for researchers to look at brain activity. They track blood flow in the brain. More activity equals more blood flow to that area of the brain. And what's really interesting about this study is they used resting state fMRI, which is really cool.
Yeah, a lot of previous research on bilingualism would have people like doing specific tasks during the scan, like naming objects in different languages. And that only gives you kind of a limited view. But resting state fMRI is really interesting because it captures brain activity when it's not focused on a task. It's like we're seeing how the brain is organized and how different regions are talking to each other, even when you're not thinking about anything in particular.
It's like eavesdropping on what your brain is doing in its downtime. And so get this, they found that people who speak two languages have stronger connections between different parts of their brain compared to people who only speak one language. And this was true even when their brains were at rest. So this might mean the bilinguals are better at things like multitasking or problem solving or even have better working memories because of these connections that are always kind of firing. But it gets even more interesting. The researchers found one connection in particular that was super strong in the bilingual brain. And that was the connection between the cerebellum, which you might know is involved in movement and coordination, and the left frontal cortex, which is involved in higher level thinking and planning, and of course language. When I think about language, the cerebellum isn't the first thing that comes to mind. So why is this connection so groundbreaking?
Well, it's really interesting because for a long time we've had this very specific idea of how the brain handles language, right? With regions like Broca's area and Wernicke's area, the ones responsible for speech production and language comprehension. But this research is really interesting because it suggests that the cerebellum might be much more involved in language processing than we originally thought.
It's like we're discovering a hidden talent in the brain.
Yeah, exactly. It kind of challenges our previous understanding of how the brain handles something as complex as language.
That's amazing. And this study just adds to the evidence that bilingualism is way more than just speaking two languages. It seems like it's almost like a full body workout for your brain. It strengthens these connections and might even make it more resilient as you get older.
Yeah.
Speaking of getting older, the study also found that the age at which someone learns a second language plays a role. They found that the younger someone learned a second language, the stronger these brain connections were. So for those of us who didn't grow up speaking multiple languages, does that mean we're out of luck?
Not at all. It's all about brain plasticity, especially when we're younger. A young brain is like super flexible, like it can change and adapt really easily. So learning a new language when you're young is like giving your brain the best possible workout.
So as we get older, does that mean it's impossible to, rewire our brains in the same way?
Not impossible. It just might take a little more work. Think of it like this. Our brains are always learning and growing, but when we're young, those connections just happen a little easier.
That makes sense. So even though it might be a bit easier for kids to pick up new languages, it's definitely not a lost cause for adults.
Exactly. The important thing is that we're always learning and challenging our brains.
So this study is about more than just language then.
Yeah. It's about how our brains can change throughout our lives and how we can actively shape our own cognitive abilities.
It makes you wonder what other everyday experiences might be rewiring our brains without us even realizing it.
Right. I mean, think about the environment we live in, for example. Did you know that there's a whole field of study called neuroarchitecture? It looks at how the places we spend our time in can actually impact our brain activity.
Really?
Yeah. For instance, studies have shown that spending time in nature can actually reduce stress, and it can even boost creativity.
Wow. So it's not just about what we learn, but also where we learn it.
Exactly. Our brains are constantly interacting with our environment and adapting.
This is also fascinating. But I think it's time we address the elephant in the room. Technology. I mean, our generation grew up with computers and the internet, sure, but kids these days are growing up with smartphones and tablets and social media. All this technology has to be impacting their brains in some way, right?
It definitely has an impact. The question is, how exactly is it affecting their brain development?
That's a good question. Is it good or bad?
Well, it's not so black and white. There's research that suggests both positive and negative effects. For example, there is this concern that Too much screen time can lead to shorter attention spans, especially in children.
I've definitely heard that before.
But then again, there are also studies showing that certain types of video games can actually improve cognitive skills, like attention and problem solving.
So it really depends on how the technology is being used.
Exactly. And it probably also depends on the individual, their brain, their environment, all sorts of factors.
So it's not as simple as saying all tech is good or all tech is bad. It's more nuanced than that. But do we have any concrete examples of how this technology might be affecting our brains?
Well, one area that's been studied a lot is the impact of screen time on attention span. There's a growing body of research that suggests that constantly switching between apps and tasks, like we tend to do with our smartphones, it might be making it harder to focus on one thing for an extended period.
Yeah, that's something I think we can all relate to, even as adults.
Absolutely. But here's the interesting thing. There are also studies showing that playing certain video games, in moderation, of course, can actually improve attention and cognitive control.
So it sounds like it's not just about the technology itself, but also how we use it.
Exactly. And it probably also varies from person to person.
This is all so fascinating. It really makes you think about how we can use technology in a way that benefits our brains instead of hindering them.
Right, and how we can prepare kids for this world that's so saturated with technology.
Exactly. Well, on that note, I think we've covered a lot of ground today.
We have. It's been quite a deep dive.
We started with bilingualism and how it can rewire your brain. And we ended up talking about technology and its impact on our minds.
It just goes to show you how complex and interconnected all of this is.
It really does. If there's one thing I hope our listeners take away from today, it's that our brains are incredibly adaptable and that we have more power than we realize to shape our own cognitive abilities.
Absolutely. And it's never too late to learn something new.
That's a great point to end on. So, to all our listeners out there, keep those brains buzzing, and we'll see you next time for another deep dive.